What's up, guys? In the last video we went over data types, arrays, and objects. And in this video we're going to look at comparisons, if, switch, and loops. So for comparisons we're going to look at how we compare values in JavaScript. Next we're going to look at the different methods and of course the use cases for those methods. After that we're going to take a look at if and switch statements individually. After that, the differences between those two and why you would use one over the other in different situations. And finally, we're going to look at loops in for and while. Alright, so let's get started. I've got my empty index.html and a script right here. And no, it's not empty. First off, comparisons. So there are two main ways of comparing values in JavaScript, and a third one, which I'm gonna take later on. So those two are loose equality and strict equality. And first off, loose equality compares two values. Kind of obvious. But loose equality converts those, either one or both, into a common type, usually a number. And loose equality is written like, let's say this variable is Boolean equals two values that are equal to each other. So let's say 2 is loose equal is by using two equal signs to the string 2. Then we can log this Boolean. Let's shorten that down to bool instead. That's much easier. So you can see that this returns true, and that's because it's going to convert the string to a number and then compare them both. And as you can see, this is the number 2, that's going to be true. So if you're going to write out something else, that's going to return false. So that's the thing about loose equality. It's going to compare those two after they have been converted, either one or the both. Then there's the strict equality, and this uses 3 equal signs. And this will not compare them by converting them to a common type. It will compare them first by type and then by value. So if the type is not the same, it's going to break and return false directly. It doesn't compare the values at all. And that's great for situations where you don't know the two values types. You want to make sure that they are the same type and value. So if we were to compare 2 and 2, it's going to be true, but if we compare 2 and 2 as a string, it's going to return false. Kind of obvious. And a lot of programmers are saying or preferring to use strict equality, and I completely agree, and I use it myself, but I also think about the fact that it's sometimes unnecessary to use the strict equality, since we sometimes know that the two values are of the same type, and that's when you can use loose equality. So in general, use strict equality, but sometimes you might as well use loose equality, but that's if you know that they are the same type. So it depends on if you want to be on the safe side or if you really feel safe about it in general. Alright, so and then there was this last type of comparison, which is Object.is. Now Object.is is a lot like strict comparison or strict equality, but there are two main differences between them. And that is, when you use strict equality, let's say 0, when you compare the negative value of 0 to the positive value of 0, it's going to return true. But that's not true from a mathematical standpoint, and that could create mathematical errors in your code. So that's why you would use something called the Object.is. That's going to take two values, and we can throw in -0 and 0. Now you can see that it's going to turn false. So that's the biggest difference. Well, not the biggest. That's one of the reasons, or the differences. God, I can't talk. Sorry. And the last one is none. The number value none. You know, this value right here. And none is never equal to anything, not even itself. But when you use Object.is, then none is equal to itself. So if we were to use strict equality in this case and log it, it's going to return false. But if we were to use Object.is instead, you might have guessed, and I said it, it's going to return true. Okay, so that's the basics of the comparisons. I'm going to leave links in the description like always, so you can dig a little bit deeper. And when you're comparing values as well, you can use something to throw in several comparisons and to define the value of a variable that is true or false. So let's say sev equals something. So we want to do several comparisons in one. We want to say that if 5 is equal to 5 and something else, then you use double and symbols, or yeah, sorry, I don't know what they're called. And 3 is equal to 3 log sev. It's going to be true. You can also emphasize this like you use in math to oh, now I used loose equality. It's going to be triple equality. I might as well use loose equality. You can emphasize this by wrapping them in parentheses to make sure that these execute first, but that's not really necessary. Yeah, but this is just to be completely clear. Then you can also use the OR statement, which uses these straight lines, which you do on Mac. For example, you do Alt 7. And this will say sev is true if 5 is equal to 5 or 3 is equal to 3. And the caveat, or the thing about this, is that if this returns true, it's not even going to care about this. But if this was false and this is true, then it's going to care about this and return true. So you can see that this is true. But if we were to set this to like 1 or something, it's going to be false. Okay? Good so far? Sweet. So next up we had if statements. So if statements is basically when you want to check a comparison or an expression, like a variable, if it's true or false, if it's a specific value, and then execute a block of code. And you write an if statement like this. You write if, two parentheses, which is going to take an expression, just like a function takes in a parameter. And this expression could be a variable, it could be a comparison as well. So let's say if 5 is equal to 5, we're going to log hell yes. Hell yeah. Sweet. But if this was equal to 1, then it's going to return, it's not going to execute that block of code. And in that case, you could use something called an else. And that you write either on the same row, you could write it right here as well, but by convention you could use the same structure as you use here with the curly brackets. You would put it right after and then curly brackets again. And else doesn't need any expression like a parameter, because it knows that if this is false, then execute this block of code. Heavens no. Cool. So that's if and else. That's just the basics of it. And of course you can use the and or statements in here as well. So 5 is equal to 5 and 1 is equal to 1. Hell yeah. You can also do or. So it's going to say hell yeah because 1 is equal to 1, but 4 is not equal to 5. But this is or. And then you could also add different possibilities of the value of the expression that you're throwing into the if. So let's say that we have a player, and this player is Max, and we want to, if player is equal to Jonathan, log hello Jonathan. I know some programmers is going to say, Max, why are you doing this? You could do this without this, that. It's just to show as an example. Then you can throw in an else if. And this is going to execute just like an if statement, but within the same. So else if is not going to execute if the first if is true, like this expression is true and runs. If the player's name is otherwise Max, we can log out hello Max, and else could log out who are you, man? So it's going to say hello Max. And if we were to say like John, for example, who are you, man? Cool. And you don't have to wrap if statements within brackets if you don't want, that is curly brackets, if you don't want to. You could skip those. But in that case, you could lose a little bit of structure. You can see that these guys could actually float into each other a little bit. It depends on who you are as a person. But then you could do several lines like this, of course. Oops. And you don't really have to indent it either. But you could also, if you have one line within these if statements, you could do just like this. This could also be a little bit of clutter, but you know, it depends on who you are in the project. So that's cool. That's if statements. Next, we're gonna look at switch statements. So switch statements are a lot like if. It's going to take an expression, but instead of checking if the expression is true or false, that is, if it's equal to a certain value, it's going to compare the value of the expression to cases. So you write a switch just like you would write a if statement like this. You have the expression right here, but you wouldn't really do it with a Boolean expression, that is, if you were to use 5 is equal to 5, because that kind of destroys the whole purpose of a switch, because that's why you would have an if-else. Because switch is used mostly for the situations where you have a lot of different varying values of the expression. So if let's take back the player again. So player is equal to Max. Switch, and you add in the expression, which is player, and then you write out the cases. So each case has its own value. That is case, it's basically like saying if player is equal to Max. Then you use a colon right here. Then you jump down you add a line break, and you can also indent just for the structure. And right here you can execute whatever code you want to do. So log out hello Max. And each case has to have its own break if you want that case to execute just the code within that case. But you can actually combine cases to do the same thing. I'm going to show you that in just a second. But we're going to add a break. Then you can say case Jonathan again. Log hello Jonathan with a nice accent. And then you also have something which is optional called a default case, and that's going to be executed whenever you don't find a matching case to the expression. So if the player name was Peter, for example, and there's no case for Peter, it would execute the default case, and that would log out Peter, what are you doing here? Okay, so we're gonna check out what that returns. Yeah, Peter, what are you doing here? It's pretty simple. But the default case is not necessary. You don't have to have it. So if you don't have it, it's not going to execute any case at all because it doesn't find any match. And by convention, the default case is always the last case, but you don't have to have it to be the last case if you don't want to. Cool. So I'm going to show you real quick what happens if you don't have a break within the case. So let's set this to max. And like you now know, if the case matches, it's going to execute this code. But since it doesn't have a break, it's going to continue executing down until it finds a break or until the switch ends. So you can guess what happens. It's going to execute hello Max and hello Jonathan, because the break happens right here. But if we add the break back, it's just going to execute hello Max. So this is something you should keep in mind, because if we were to remove break completely and add in, for example, one for Peter as well, it's going to execute all those three plus the default right here. Okay? So adding back the breaks, and you don't really need a break on the default unless the default are anywhere else, because the default is only going to execute if there's no other matching case, and the default is the final case in this case. There's a lot of cases. Yeah, so, and what I was talking about before is that you can combine cases to do the same thing. It's kind of like adding a lot of if-else, or adding a lot of a lot of ands. So if you were to write out this and this and this and this, you know, if you had a lot of comparisons doing in the same if, and usually you would have kind of long expressions. Let's say we had a variable called, this is a var variable actually, is equal to this is also a variable, maybe. And for those of you who think I'm going to write out these kind of variables in real life projects, don't worry, I don't. I do. You can see that this quickly becomes an extremely long if statement, and you might not mind this, but a lot of people mind this, and you shouldn't do this in general unless it's extremely necessary. That's why you have these kind of cases. So in this situation you would write out the same cases doing the same thing. Just imagine that these are different variables. Let's say var1, var2, var3, var4. That's going to execute this. So var, or let's say, I don't know, container, yeah. Cool. And then we have var1 equals max, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so Peter, John, and Alex. Cool. So if the container has the same value as var1, var2, var3, and or var4, it's going to execute this. And in this case, it's going to be var1. And that's going to execute hello Max. Or we could do, for the fun, do hello Max. So if we were to change this to John, hello John, by using this simple concatenation. Okay, so that's the basics of a switch. If you have any questions, just feel free to leave them in the comments or hit me up on Twitter at any point. The next thing was for and while loops. So we're going to start off with while. And while loops, they create loops, and they take they take statements or expressions as parameters, and as long as that expression is true, it's going to run the while loop. So let's say var name equals max, while name is equal to max. So while name is equal to max, and this will return true in this case because name is equal to max, we're going to change name to John. This is a really bad example, but you still, I hope you still get the basics of it. And now the name is John because we changed. So it ran once. Ran the while loop. Okay? So let's take a different example. Let's say we have a counter variable that is 0. So while the counter is less than 3, we want to increase that counter by 1. You can either do counter plus equals 1 or just iterate it by 1 by doing these double plus signs. And then you can log ran while loop again and then log out the counter instead. Cool. Running that, it would run 3 times and the value would be 3. That's because we could log out the counter so you can see the different values. It's going to have 1, 2, and 3 because it's still going to execute when the counter is 2, and that's the point when the counter gets the value of 3, because one would think that the counter would have just the value of 2 here, since as long as it's less than 3, but you probably got it. It's just that I was slow when I started programming. Yeah, so that's the basics of whiles, and do not do not do this. You'll break the internet. I promise. No, you won't. Yeah, don't do it. And then we have the for loops. So the for loops are very similar to while loops, but the for loops instead take 3 optional parameters in the actual for instance. So writing out a for loop is just like an if or a function. They are functions basically. And these 3 are initialization, condition, and final expression. So initialization is usually where you create or set values of a variable. And in condition, you set a condition. It's a comparison that returns true or false. And that comparison is going to run for each time the loop runs. So for each iteration. And as long as that condition is true, the for loop will continue running. And then you have the final expression, and that is a piece of code that's going to run after the for loop has run once, or after the iteration has run. So how you run or how you write a counter in a for loop, you do var, and then you name a counter. You usually use a 1 character long variable, and it could be I for iteration. I is equal to 0. And now we're going to create a condition. As long as I is less than 3, we're going to run some code, and that is usually where you iterate that counter variable. And you do that, like I said, by using double plus signs. And this is going to run 3 times. So log this ran. Woo. This ran. Woo! Cool. Sorry for probably making you deaf. That's sweet. So like I said, these 3 parameters are optional, so you can run with 2, 1, or 3, or none of them actually. The only thing is that for loop expects 2 semicolons, since it's 3 parameters and it's 2 spaces between 3, so it's 2 semicolons. So we could first run without the initialization. So let's copy that and just paste it out here, like that. And it's still perfect example of double quotes. It's still going to run. Yep, still going to run 3 times. Cool. And I probably would have had a semicolon there as well. It's not, you don't need it, it's optional, but just for the structure. You could also run without the condition. It's going to leave the semicolon in there. But if we don't run with the condition, the for loop will continue running forever. It will be an infinite loop, like running a while true. So that's when you have to write a condition in here. So if I is less than 3, no, sorry, if I is equal to 3, then you want to just jump out of the for loop, and you do that by, just like you did with a switch, you can break. So it's going to run 3 times. You can see illegal return statement, so you cannot use a return because for don't return any values. So you do break, cool, it runs. And you could also break out the final expression part and do it down here instead. Cool. So for loops are pretty cool in that way because you don't have to do them in an exact way. JavaScript doesn't need to be done in an exact way either, but you get it. Yeah, so that was it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate the good feedback that I've gotten, actually amazing feedback. And if you feel like it, if you had any questions or suggestions, I would love to hear it. So leave it in the comments or hit me up on Twitter. And if you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. It really helps. And if you would like to see any more videos, please do subscribe. I truly appreciate it. All right, take care, guys.